and welcome to this WTO Public Forum session on green government procurement in an open international trade environment. Thank you for joining us. I am delighted to have with me today a very distinguished group of 4 experts whom I will be introducing in a little while. My name is Reto Malacrida. I am from the WTO Secretariat and I will be your moderator today. Let me just explain how we propose to structure this session. I will first give each panelist an opportunity to make short opening remarks. After that, I will address questions to the panelists. And if time is on our side, we will be happy to turn to questions from the audience. With that short introduction, let me turn to the panelists' opening remarks. We will first have the pleasure of hearing from Mrs. Sandra Hamilton. Mrs. Hamilton, if you perhaps give the audience a little wave so everyone can see you. I would also say that everyone can access detailed biographical information on the WTO website for this event. So I will limit myself to just give a few highlights for each of the panelists. So Sandra Hamilton is currently a PhD researcher with the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. In her research, she examines how governments can use government procurement to improve lives and move markets towards the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Sandra Hamilton, I would invite you now to take the floor for your brief opening remarks. Kindly remember to unmute yourself before speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Reto. So government procurement is at a crossroads. Is it a price taker or a market shaper? We know that governments are under pressure to create an economy that better serves society, and concern that economics has become disconnected from social progress has led to high-profile economists like Mark Carney, Mariana Mazzucato, Kate Raworth, advocating for governments to take a more proactive role in shaping the directionality and social responsibility of global markets. So to achieve this, we need to be open to redesigning our public institutions, to transforming how value is defined in government procurement, moving away from systems that advance low bid, race to the bottom tenders, to advancing rise to the top procurement systems that engage, stimulate, and reward the most responsible and sustainable market actors. So my research has identified 4 themes arising at the domestic level, each offering a potential pathway forward for a revitalized GPA fit for the 21st century. Theme 1 is the move to mandatory sustainable public procurement. 2, the rise of supply chain transparency legislation. 3, the importance of knowledge hubs and cross-border collaborations that will help us build our capacity to stimulate competition against green social criteria. The 4th is well-being economics, where people and planet thrive while also considering the needs of future generations. Mandatory sustainable public procurement requires a fundamental shift in our thinking. It means following the lead of Japan, the Netherlands, and the UK to create a more green, circular, and social value through taxpayer-funded contracts. In Japan, by implementing mandatory green public procurement at the central government level, 95% of procurement across 21 priority categories is now green. And across all levels of government, 70% of procurement is green. That's the highest country-level achievement of any nation. As the world's single biggest buyers, governments must lead by example, sending a clear signal to the markets that government procurement serves a very different purpose in society than regulation, that the exploitation of people and planet will not be rewarded in taxpayer-funded contracts, and that awards will be made in part based upon contractual commitments to addressing climate change, poverty, and inequality. Our collective failure to act will result in a GPA becoming an irrelevant instrument in sustainable global governance, increasing the risk of a fragmented multilateral system, missing the opportunity to harness the incredible power of $1.7 trillion in government procurement across 48 countries, to build back greener, fairer and better. Given the climate crisis, are we now entering an era where protecting the environment cannot remain an optional extra, and where social considerations are no longer silenced, where sustainable public procurement is mandatory? This is certainly a timely debate, and I look forward to today's panel discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much indeed, Sandra Hamilton, for your spirited opening remarks, setting out the landscape in which we are moving and towards which we may be moving. With that, let me turn to our next distinguished speaker, who I have the pleasure of introducing. He is Mr. Ryohei Tobibayashi. He is the Deputy Director with the International Trade Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. He represents Japan as the lead capital-based delegate in the WTO Committee on Government Procurement. Mr. Tobibayashi, you have the floor. Again, as a reminder, kindly make sure you unmute yourself.
Thank you, Reto. And thank you very much for mentioning to Japan's experience, Sandra. Japan is very much honored that it is one of the original members of the original GPA, well, being more than 40 years. And as Sandra mentioned, Japanese government enacted so-called Act on Promoting Green Procurement in 2000. This is a kind of millennium thing. And under this act, Japan is have been realizing the green procurement. The basic concept of this act is to realize the circular economy in the country as a whole. But to achieve that goal, public procurement can be a good model for other local entities or companies, enterprises, or ordinary people. Government procurement is something relatively easily controlled or managed by the government entity itself. As Sandra mentioned, central agencies and ministries are obliged to consider about the environmental criteria when it purchases goods and services, not only goods. And local entities are encouraged to follow that practice. And thanks to these, due to this enactment, we achieved such a high score in the purchase procurement of environmental goods, as Sandra mentioned. Under that act, we have established a range of criteria for now currently 22 categories instead of 21, and as much as 282 items are designated as a priority environmentally friendly items. And we have a range of evaluation criteria and considerating factors. This is the domestic stage, and in the international stage, as a part of the WTO GPA committee, Japan is actively participating in the discussion of the working group on sustainable procurement. Of course, green procurement is one of the most important topics of that working group, and the Japanese government is a member of informal discussions. TEST represents the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structure discussion, which was established in this March. Through those international level discussions, Japan is now trying to expand our concept of green procurement globally as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ryohei Tobibayashi, for giving us the perspective of a government implementing green public procurement and doing so in a very advanced way. With that, I would immediately turn to our next speaker, who is Mrs. Liesbeth Casier. She is currently a senior policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD for short. She works with IISD's public procurement and infrastructure finance team and focuses on innovation in public procurement and sustainable asset valuation. Liesbeth Casier, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Reto, and thank you very much for having me here today. What I would like to do in my opening remarks is provide some context for this discussion in relation to the challenges that procurers face, let's say, on the ground today in implementing SPP or GPP. So in ISD's work with public procurers globally in developed and developing countries, to raise awareness on SPP and to use procurement to foster innovation, to drive sustainability, we've seen lots of things change since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, and in the past 5 to 10 years, this has really been a moving field. We've also seen much more awareness on the complex problems such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and the important role that governments here have today to address those. But when we speak to public procurers and work with the procurement agencies, we see a lot of challenges for them to fully use procurement as a driver of sustainable development. Even if the legal frameworks today on national level and the ones that regulate procurement on subnational level allow to buy based on best value and not just on lowest price, in practice, what we see is that it still remains business as usual to buy based on lowest price, despite the advances that have been made. So this means buying without taking into account the life cycle cost or total cost of ownership of goods and services that procurers are buying. It means without enough specifications that relate to environmental criteria, for example, which is problematic if we really want to move in the area of public procurement. So why does that still remain such common practice? And there are just a couple of points here that I want to highlight. So first of all, and Sandra hinted at that as well in her remarks, is that green public procurement today is not mandatory. But what we do see is a lot of the surrounding policy frameworks that also have an impact on procurement that are really moving in the direction to addressing climate change, addressing the environmental and social issues we have today. Lots of countries are making net zero targets or have net zero pathways in place. They make pledges. We've seen the Green Deal in Europe. We see the EU taxonomy as a policy instrument to define what is sustainable and what is not. And procurement should take advantage of those conversations to be better informed on what to buy and how to buy. Another challenge that we see is the ability in procurement agencies to fully, let's say, make the business case that buying green or sustainable actually also makes financial sense through applying life cycle costing approaches. But we also see a lack of ability to capture those cost savings that come from buying green. To conduct, for example, proper risk assessments on what if we don't buy sustainable, what are the risks that we're actually putting in front of us in relation to what our citizens need. Another challenge we see is the capacity and skill sets currently hosted in procurement agencies that need to change, be beefed up to really move from thinking about procurement as an administrative function to a more strategic function of government. And especially to empower and equip procurers to be able to buy the best available solutions that meet certain sustainability criteria. And lastly, I think there is not enough opportunity to measure, monitor, and communicate about the benefits of SPP and to really let procurers shine also in the excellent and very difficult work that they do. The opportunity to share best practices is sometimes not sufficiently enough available to really make full use of this space. There are solutions to this. Thankfully, we've seen just in the previous speakers great examples, and I think there's an opportunity to scale those solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liesbeth, Casier, for sharing the perspective also of the procuring entities charged with implementing green government procurement policies. And so we are left with one more panelist to introduce, and it is my pleasure now to introduce Mrs. Heilman Grier. She is now the trade principal with a US consulting firm, and formerly she has served as the senior procurement negotiator of the Office of the US Trade Representative, which we all know as the USTR. Ms. Heilman Grier, you have the floor, please, for your opening statement.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all today. The GPA has two overarching purposes. One is to open foreign procurement markets, and the other is to establish rules to ensure that the procurement covered by the GPA is conducted in a transparent, non-discriminatory, and impartial manner. Within these broad goals, the GPA must not be an obstacle to the pursuit of environmentally sustainable procurement, and it need not be. GPA 2012, the revision, the major revision in 2012, clarified that technical specifications can be applied to protect the environment and conserve natural resources. It also added a provision that environmental characteristics may be included in evaluation criteria in awarding bids. That text is now 15 years old, so it needs to be examined to determine whether revisions are necessary to more effectively promote green procurement. But negotiations take a long time. But the GPA 2012 also established a work program, as Toby mentioned, on sustainable procurement, and green procurement is part of that discussion. So the GPA parties should consider two avenues. One is to examine the text to see if it's necessary to revise it. But the second would be to use this work program to establish guidelines or best practices that parties can use to advance green procurement goals within the context of the GPA. If the parties decide that they need to revise the GPA to more effectively promote the green procurement goals, they could undertake narrow focus negotiations of the GPA text, and those negotiations could be done much more quickly than if it was a comprehensive negotiation. Such negotiations could be completed, I think, relatively quickly. The guide for, or the precedent for doing more focused early negotiations on text would be in 1988 amendments to the GPA's predecessor, the GATT code. And there they, within a fairly short time, were able to amend the agreement, focusing only on text. As the GPA parties pursue actions to support green procurement in a more vigorous and effective way, they must also consider the effect that this will have on developing countries. Adding any special measures that would enable developing countries to, they should be considering measures that would enable developing countries to phase in any green procurement requirements. Any new measures must not lock out developing countries. The developing countries are the key to the future growth of the GPA membership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heilman Grier, for focusing already on the text of the GPA and what it already undeniably permits and the success that it has already achieved, but also highlighting also some further room for improvement, which we will have an opportunity to shine a spotlight on in just a little bit. So with that first round of introductory statements, I think we are ready now to engage in a bit of dialogue and a bit of a question and answer session. So we have essentially three topics that we'd like to pursue. And if I may just go one by one. So our first area of focus would be to explain the problem or the situation as we perceive it at the international and domestic level. And we might just summarize it by saying, Geneva, we have a problem from the perspective of those charged with applying the GPA. So if I may just move to the very first question, and this is in three parts, but we will be looking for an integrated response. And so the three parts of the first question is, why is it that now we suddenly see so much activity at the domestic level in the area of green public procurement? And why does the domestic level need to care about the international level, specifically the GPA, in implementing green public procurement policies? And finally, why do those of us who work at the international level need to pay attention to what is happening in the area of green public procurement at the domestic level? Do we really need to talk about the green public procurement now at the international level? So for a first answer to all of these questions and sort of provide a better sense of where the problem lies, may I first turn to Liesbeth Casier for an attempt at trying to give us a sense of what some answers could represent.
Yes, thank you for that. Certainly not an easy pack of questions to answer, but I'll take a first shot at it. So I think there are various reasons why we see the procurement discussion surfacing, I think both at domestic as well as international level. So on the one hand, and I hinted to that in my opening remarks, we have the challenges, I think, around climate, biodiversity, but also the health crisis is really in our face here. So increasingly, we also see an understanding that climate-related risks are real. If I think about infrastructure projects, for example, what governments will buy locks us in for a long time to come. Infrastructure investments and procurements these are long-term impacts, long-term decision making, and we need to make sure that infrastructure we buy today is, for example, climate resilient. We've seen many climate-related disasters over the past years, where I think this has really provided governments with the need to look at what do we need to change in our procurement process to, for example, incorporate that climate risk angle, but also to incorporate what is the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions, to be able to compare the one procurement that is more low carbon versus the other. We've seen the Biden administration in executive order on climate-related financial risks in May of this year, pointing explicitly at the federal procurement, which needs to take into account those aspects. So I think in response to those crises, we've seen elements change and put procurement at the forefront. We have lots of recovery plans these past 18 months being drawn up by governments, where a lot of public spending will happen. A lot of that will be channeled through procurement, which immediately puts procurement in a spotlight. And in connection with those challenges that we face, I think procurement is very much at the forefront of the discussion on domestic levels, as well as subnational levels. I would also want to point at the roles that cities play here in deploying a lot of public money, where they're closer to citizens and closer to the needs of citizens, which I think have changed over the past decade. And citizens have become more vocal about their needs as well. So I think there's a mix of things that has points various levels with the need to look at sustainable and green public procurement. So it's almost by nature that the discussion is also, I think, coming to the WTO, where we've seen the GPA as an instrument that, of course, has an influence on how procurement is done. And I would say even in the countries that are not GPA members, the GPA is looked at as an instrument for how procurement is being done with due regard to transparency principles, etc., and making sure that procurement is done in a cost-efficient way. So it's, of course, the various instruments out there that countries look at to be able to advance on this agenda.
Thank you so much, Liesbeth Casier, for handling this extensive question so elegantly and briefly. Let me give an opportunity as well to Sandra Hamilton to come in on this first question.
Thank you. I think it's also that we've recognized that government absolutely cannot be part of the problem. They absolutely need to be part of the solution. So, you know, we have been driving down prices, and we understood that that was going to be good for society. And now we're realizing actually we do need some rules as to shaping how we go forward for a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive society. So the global governance system, I think, is lagging currently. The leadership at the subnational, now national level, and it's time for us to agree that government procurement has the ultimate responsibility in leading the way forward. It would be very difficult for governments to legislate responsible and sustainable practice in business if they are not the ultimate and responsible, sustainable buyers themselves. So that's going to take some capacity building. It's going to take a shift in thinking. And I think that's what we're talking about now is how do we shift that thinking so that governments are leading and not lagging?
Thank you very much for complimenting Liesbeth Casier's response, Sandra Hamilton. So with that, having sort of focused on the developments at the domestic level, let us also reflect a little bit on what's happening at the international level and specifically here at the WTO. So may I turn to Ryohei Tobibayashi to maybe give us an update on what is happening at the WTO right now in the area of trade and environmental sustainability, and how does it relate to the GPA?
Thank you. Probably I should be the one to respond to this question. As I briefly mentioned, touch upon in my opening statement, as a part of the GB committee's activities, we have a working group on sustainable procurement. Well, as Jen mentioned, we have been discussing on this issue in the last 9 years or so, immediately after the adoption of the revised agreements. So we still don't have concrete or tangible outcome from the workshop's discussion, probably partially because of our agenda is very broad. Sustainable procurement concept is quite broad. It may include from the gender equality or human rights, and green procurement is one of the concepts of the sustainable procurement. So if we will focus on the discussion on green procurement, because we already have a very good stepping board in the GPA itself as Article 10.6 or 10.9. So it will be the way to have the tangible result in the foreseeable future. To have the on the green procurement, we need to focus on that subject. And as I mentioned in my opening statement too, we have a test structure, informal dialogue discussion, which covers a broad range of environmental issue from the border adjustment, carbon border adjustments to the reduction of the tax reduction of environment-friendly goods and services. In that discussion, Japan made a proposal which contains some tariff issues and regulatory issues. And in the regulatory issues, one of our proposal is to disseminate the concept of MFF notion to the non-GPA members if and as far as the procurement of environment-friendly goods are concerned. We have not yet ready to propose exactly what the eco-friendly goods or services mean, but we believe that it was further discussing among the broader members, because TEST has currently 23 members. It is bigger than the members of the GPA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryohei Tobibayashi, for giving us some insight into what is happening at the WTO. And I think we've already seen that there is always a risk of the WTO working in silos, where some members focus and talk about trade and environment in one context, and then other discussions happen elsewhere in the organization without that necessarily being done in a coordinated or transparent fashion. Now, let us move to our second topic before we drill down and look at the GPA more specifically, and that is the question that is now posed after this initial exchange, which is that we have already heard from our distinguished panelists that we have a very dynamic domestic level in the area of green government procurement. And we have a somewhat less dynamic, still engaged, but still a less dynamic level at the international level, specifically the WTO. So one can see the makings of possible challenges ahead. And so that's the background to the next question, which asks about, what approach should we take at the international level in response to the dynamism that we see at the domestic level. So my next question, which initially goes to Sandra Hamilton, is the following: should the GPA be used as a means, as an instrument to promote and achieve collective action by the GPA parties in the interest of global environmental sustainability? Or is the role of the GPA rather just to enable environmentally sustainable procurement and give clearer guidance to those GPA parties that wish to exploit the scope for green public procurement to the maximum? For instance, should the GPA require rather than merely permit that GPA parties use environmental sustainability related evaluation criteria? Sandra Hamilton, you have the floor for this question.
Thank you. The alternative is, should the high income countries representing the GPA should the environment be an option to ignore? That's unthinkable in the 21st century. It can no longer be an option that we ignore environmental externalities or social externalities of our purchasing decisions. So Sustainable Development Goal 12, specifically 12.7, calls upon nations to advance sustainable public procurement in line with their national priorities. But we have a very clear set of global priorities. And if anything, we've learned anything from COVID is our interconnectedness. And that's what trade has done for us over the last 30 years. It has built a very connected economy. But let's face it, it is the role of the highest income countries to redesign their procurement systems to make sure that we're not only doing no harm, which would be an important first step, but that we are proactively and intentionally required to leverage our government taxpayer-funded systems to elevate living standards and improve conditions for people and planet. The alternative to me would be very, very difficult to justify in the 21st century. So what we really need at the international level is clarity on a new framework for competition, and where we can compete on non-financial green and social goals. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much indeed, Sandra Hamilton. At this point, I would like to allow two quick comments from two of our fellow panelists. First, Liesbeth Casier, followed by Jean Heilman Grier.
Yes, thank you for that. Very, very quick addition, but very much in line, I believe, with what Sandra has just mentioned. What is at the core of good public procurement is to buy the best value for money. And so what is needed is a discussion on what does value mean in light of indeed national priorities, but also the priorities that we've seen in other international fora, thinking about the SDGs, thinking about Paris and the climate agreements that we have. So that really needs to be at the heart of the discussion.
Just a quick comment. I think it's important that the GPA be used to promote, but not prescribe particular methods of approaching green procurement. I mean, as Sandra mentioned, most of the GPA parties are, well-developed countries with high incomes, but it's also trying to broaden its base. And if it's going to be too prescriptive, it's going to discourage other countries from joining, not to mention having difficulty trying to come up with some consensus. I mean, as Toby mentioned, this working group's been working for 9 years and it hasn't gotten public results yet. So I think we need to look at what's realistic.
Thank you very much, Jean Heilman Grier, for your comment, which precisely provides the opening for my next question regarding the response at the international level. So assuming that the GPA parties were to clarify or modify the text of the GPA to allow them more scope for environmental sustainability and perhaps, excuse me, even mandate sustainability-based evaluation criteria, could this actually produce unintended consequences of the type that Jean Grier just mentioned? Would not developing countries be discouraged from joining the GPA because their suppliers might find it challenging to meet environmental sustainability criteria in developed country procurement markets? May I suggest that Jean, again, take the lead since she has already developed some thoughts in that direction?
Yes, thank you. The concern, I think, is that mandating sustainability-based evaluation criteria could discourage developing countries from joining the GPA. And if the GPA is to be the gold standard, it needs to have as many members as possible in the WTO. It currently only has less than 1/3 of the membership. And it needs to be looking at how to bring other countries into the GPA to follow the overall standards. And I think mandating certain evaluation criteria could discourage future growth of the GPA. And it's not in the GPA's interest to make it more difficult for developing countries to join. But I think the GPA has a role to show leadership and set out standards and guidelines, but not to be too prescriptive. But if the GPA does set up guidelines and all, it has to provide for, or should provide for, developing countries to delay or phase in any requirements rather than taking them on at the beginning of their accession. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Liesbeth, Casier, would you like to weigh in as well on this question?
Yes, thank you for that. I certainly agree with Jean that over-prescribing at the level of different legal texts is unhelpful for using procurement as a driver for innovation and for sustainability. In fact, something that we see in our work with procurers is that even at the level of preparing bids, if we overprescribe the technical solutions that we want, we might not buy the most innovative and actually best available solution in terms of sustainability criteria. So we wouldn't advocate for having like an over-prescriptive use of sustainability targets. But I think there is a difference between that and actually mandating buying beyond lowest price. So I think the level at which we insert the sustainability targets doesn't have to be at the level of the GPA, and not even, I think, at the level of national procurement laws, because that information on what the sustainability target should be will come from sectoral regulation or will come from guidance, policy guidance that sits outside of that specific legal framework. But what we absolutely need is for procurers to understand that these other regulations in the different sectors, very dependent on what a procurer is actually buying, is guidance that needs to be made available to them in a language that is adapted to be used by procurers.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. So with that, I think we have given a bit of an overview and hopefully a better understanding of the situation and the policy landscape and the direction of travel that we could envisage at the international level in response to the domestic level developments. We've already seen that our panel sees eye to eye on some of these aspects, but not necessarily on all the details. So it is time now to actually focus on some of these details and ask ourselves, what, if anything, could we envisage as a community, the GPA community, to either clarify or modify or improve in the text of the GPA? And here I would like to preface our discussion by referring back to something that Heilman Grier said at the outset, which is that the current version of the text already marks progress relative to the prior versions, that a few things have been clarified and that there is scope for green public procurement for sure. So we come from a place from saying the GPA is already good. However, perhaps, you know, with the dynamism we see at the domestic level, we can actually even start envisaging further improvements that would help the domestic level implement their policy in line with international trade commitments. So with that little introduction, may I propose that we tackle a first sort of quite detailed question that focuses on the existing text of the GPA. And the question is the following. The GPA right now gives a non-exhaustive list of possible evaluation criteria that procuring entities can use. And thereby it leaves doubt about which precise evaluation criteria can be used. So should a short shipping distance or a short haulage distance, for instance, be a permissible criterion on the basis that this could mean lower greenhouse gas emissions? Or would that be something that is or isn't allowed under the GPA as it stands, given the non-exhaustive list of criteria? Or would this rather go against the very notion of international trade with all GPA parties, not just your neighboring ones? So to tackle this admittedly tricky question, may we first invite Heilman Grier to offer her perspective.
Thank you. To allow shipping distance to be a permissible criterion could too easily undermine the market opening aim of the GPA and its requirement to provide non-discriminatory access to procurement. Such a criterion would clearly benefit domestic suppliers or even suppliers just across the border in another GPA country to the disadvantage of suppliers of parties. So I think the GPA parties would have to look really hard at whether any sort of criterion that related to distance or shipping distance as a factor should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Sandra Hamilton has an interest also in expressing a view on this question.
I think shortening shipping distances is not perhaps the best example. The better example would be reducing carbon emissions. The shorter shipping distance might, the shorter transportation distance might reduce carbon emissions, but it might not. I mean, we've actually heard that there are instances where it's actually more efficient to buy things from a distance, especially if it's like greenhouse tomatoes are the alternative. So I think the focus has to be on net zero, and the focus has to be on a reduction of waste in how we buy. We absolutely need to make sure that we can reward actors, economic actors, against verifiable, objective criteria and technical specs that are in keeping with net zero agenda and the reduction of waste. So I think we don't always need to assume that that means shipping distances. It might, but it also might not. And I think the bigger question for the GPA is market access the priority of today's society? Is that in fact what's going to get us to a sustainable, inclusive future? Or is it changing the consumption patterns of 48 governments? Could that actually lift standards and have a bigger impact on the planet? I think that's a debate worth happening.
Thank you very much indeed. May I move the panel along to a related question, also to do with evaluation criteria. As you know, the GPA requires that procuring entities that use multiple evaluation criteria determine in advance the relative importance of each criterion in their ultimate evaluation of an offer. Would it be useful to have greater clarity about how much importance can be given to environmental sustainability? For instance, could a sustainability-related criterion be as important as price and quality, but no more important? And would it be useful to know any maximum percentage weight that could be given to a sustainability-related criterion? May I direct this question to Liesbeth Casier, please?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Certainly not an easy one, but my answer actually builds upon what Sandra just mentioned and what Jean also commented on. I think what's important is to have the ability to use performance-based and or outcome-based specifications that really target the, let's say, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the reduction of air pollution when cities are purchasing mobility solutions for the needs of citizens. So what's important is that there are platforms where procurers that are often very specialized in a particular area of spending can actually exchange on how they have been awarding contracts and how that price, quality, sustainability aspects ratio has been used. I think it's not possible today to say this much should go to price, this much should go to sustainability, but there are areas of spending where procurement agencies have very successfully balanced those things in a manner that worked for their city, for their country. But just to give perhaps a tangible example, when I was reviewing some SPP, GPP case studies, let's say, take the city of Munich for a catering contract a couple of years ago. What they did is they introduced sustainability criteria for this catering contract, and they awarded the contract 40% on price, 50% on variety and taste of the meals that the caterers could offer for schools and other public facilities, and 10% on some other social and environmental criteria. Now, whether that can be taken as a gold standard on how we divide such evaluation criteria, I think it's very difficult to say. But what is useful there is that other cities that are buying and going out for catering contracts can go and see how the city of Munich has done that in this specific case. And this is just an example to make this a little bit more tangible about what we're talking about. So what I think is very important is that we share how that can be done, because that enables procurers to actually move this discussion forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing a very concrete example to illustrate the issue. I'm keeping an eye on time and would therefore propose that we tackle one additional question inside the panel, and then I have a question or two from the audience that I would like to share and see if the panel is inclined to try for an answer. So the one additional question tries to really look at a policy issue, and specifically how procuring entities would use technical specifications to pursue environmental sustainability goals and or evaluation criteria. So the question is this: would it be useful if the GPA were, through its text, to steer the parties of the GPA towards using sustainability-related evaluation criteria with appropriate weighting along the lines of what we have just discussed, rather than allowing the parties to include such requirements in the technical specifications, with the market access denying consequences that flow from this for those suppliers who do not fully meet those precise technical specifications, but might nonetheless have products that are otherwise attractive to the procuring entity. So would doing this promote rather than stifle competition and thus be consonant with the spirit of internationally open procurement markets. May I invite Jean Heilman Grier to tackle this policy question?
Thank you. I think the short answer should be that the parties should have the choice of whether they use their technical specifications or evaluation criteria to address their concerns and their interests in promoting sustainability. The current GPA would seem to allow for such criteria in the evaluation criteria. First, it does not provide an exhaustive list of evaluation criteria. So clearly there could be room for having sustainability criteria. And I think Liesbeth earlier just mentioned an excellent example where that has been done. The key issue is that they obviously disclose all of their evaluation criteria. There's also, I would point out, the Article 9 or Article 10.9 in the GPA that refers to including environmental characteristics in evaluation criteria. So that's already allowed. I think the key issue is to provide flexibility with respect to technical specifications. What could be added is some provision that allows for or equivalent provisions to be added in terms of technical specifications. The GPA already requires that for design standards that there should be a provision that you can meet that standard by providing something that's equivalent. So the same thing could be allowed here.
Thank you very much for your answer to this question. I think we have time for a quick comment from Sandra Hamilton also in response to this question.
Yes, thank you. I think the evaluation criteria is really where we move away from race to the bottom on price to where we give the opportunity to rise to the top. And I think it's where public procurement can go and can innovate the processes. So obviously it needs to be clearly stated how value will be defined, what the weightings are. I think a minimum weighting in line with the UK's current approach. In the UK, all central government procurement must have a 10% evaluation weighting against social value, which could include environmental outcomes. I think having a minimum will help drive some change into the system and build capacity for innovation in how we define value against these non-financial, social and environmental criteria. But I wouldn't agree with a maximum or a prescription because it's very different across different categories. And I think that's where we want to build the capacity of government procurement. The City of Manchester has a policy right now that requires 30% weighting on social and environmental criteria. I believe the City of Oslo also has the same. So definitely at the subnational level, these policies are there. And what we're really saying is we have to move away from the 70% of government awarded contracts that are still awarding on price. There has to be a mechanism that moves us forward away from that, solely on price, I should say.
Thank you so much. I suggest at this point that we make sure that we give our audience an opportunity to also ask questions. And so without further ado, let me share a first question that in the meantime I have received as a moderator of the session. And so one of our participants is asking whether the panel thinks that voluntary sustainability standards could be of help to public procurers to buy based on best value whilst addressing risks. And I think the question is specifically directed at Liesbeth Casier, if you feel up to answering it. So let me repeat the question. Do you think that voluntary sustainability standards could be of help for public procurers to buy based on best value while addressing risks?
Yes, I think sustainability standards in general and standards behind labeling requirements as well, they actually provide information to buyers to know what sustainability means for that specific item that they're procuring for. However, I think that at this point in time, with the crisis that we're in, only relying on voluntary mechanisms is not enough.
Thank you. Did any other panelists wish to weigh in on this question? Or shall we move to the next one? Sandra Hamilton, please.
Okay, I would just like to agree with Liesbeth and say that without the obligation, the mindset and the culture of public procurement won't change. You know, we are in 1994, the creation of the WTO and the GPA, we prohibited non-commercial criteria. The revisions in 2012 allowed environmental, but we're still talking as an exception. And until we move to normalizing responsible and sustainable purchasing and having it as an obligation, that will also lift standards across other countries, as we have an obligation for high-income countries to do better than do no harm in their buying, but to proactively and intentionally use this mechanism to actually do some good and achieve our goals. So I think we need an obligation. We need to signal that the GPA is on side with non-financial evaluation criteria, as long as it is done in a fair, open, transparent way, and everybody knows what the weightings are in how value will be defined. But we have to do something to shift the culture that has been in place for 30 odd years now. It's a big shift.
Thank you very much. So another question I have from the audience is the following. Is there any indication that green public procurement might be used in practice to favor or protect domestic suppliers, for instance, through the use of the selection of the evaluation criteria? So is there, it's the famous protectionism in disguise argument. Is there something to be worried about here based on what we have seen to date? Is there any panelists who would be willing to offer a perspective on that one? Jean Heilman Grier, I think you would need to unmute yourself, please.
I think that's always a concern. And I think that's a concern that isn't just would not just apply to environmental considerations, but that's always a concern that needs to be watched.
Any other colleague wish to weigh in on this? Liesbeth, Casier, please.
Very, very briefly, I agree with Jean. This concern is always there, but what matters, and which is actually at the heart of sustainable and green public procurement, is that it's done in a transparent way. And so if we compete on the right criteria, it can be used as an instrument to really foster sustainable development, to tackle a lot of crises. What matters is the transparency element, which is key for good competition, and which is key for sustainability as well.
Ryohei Tobibayashi, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Reto. Japan's Act is conducted in the manner like that. Well-defined, appropriately well-defined, accessible to all, and verifiable and non-discriminatory manner. Under these practices, we have no complaints from the domestic or other foreign companies. So this is very sustainable way of doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm keeping an eye on time, and we do need to wrap up at this point, unfortunately, much as I, and I'm sure everyone else would enjoy continuing this very inspiring and instructive discussion with our distinguished panel. I think the last question has just shown that much as we do want to promote environmental sustainable public procurement, there is still justification for the GPA to make sure that there is an opening for international trade to continue to thrive. And I think we have seen that the GPA, much as it has clarified some aspects of environmentally sustainable public procurement, there are others where I think further clarity or improvements could still be envisaged. And I think the point of our discussion was in part to highlight that perhaps the time has already come to start engaging in that very interesting discussion at the international level so that we can accommodate the domestic level and meet its practical needs, as some of our panelists have impressively highlighted during this session. So with that, let me just thank, first of all, our translators or interpreters, I should say, as well as our colleagues working behind the scenes. But first and foremost, I want to thank each and every one of our distinguished panels for giving us their time and sharing their expertise. It has been extremely stimulating. We thank you so very much for making time. And with that, I am handing back on time, I hope, to our colleagues from the Public Forum organizers. Thank you, and all the best to everyone.